Good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending our first Between the Rows tour virtual. I'm Claire White. I am the Outreach Director for the Corn Marketing Program, and this program is brought to you by the Corn Marketing Program. I know a lot of people are attending for some RUP credits. We will be giving you that information at the end of the program. If you do have any questions while you're watching this, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A or the chat box at the bottom of your screen. We'll make sure the panelists get those and answer those questions either during the presentation or we'll follow up at a later time. So our first presentation will be brought to you by the U.S. Grains Council. We have Carrie from the Grains Council here to give you a short presentation. Just a little bit of background on the Grains Council. They develop export markets for barley, corn, sorghum, and other related products, including ethanol and DDGs. They do have presence in 28 locations, and they operate in more than 50 countries and the EU. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Carrie. Thank you for joining us.
All right, thank you, Claire, and good morning, everybody. Let me share my screen here. So you can see I've put together just a few slides. But as Claire said, I'm Senior Director of Global Programs for the U.S. Grain Council. I've worked for the Grain Council for 27 years now, since Jim was looking for a number before. But in many different positions of that, and about almost nearly 20 years of that working in 4 of our different international offices, but spent the last about 5 years now back here in our Washington, D.C. headquarters. As was stated, we do have operations around the globe, and these golden teardrops are where we have actual offices or regional offices, and the smaller dots are where we have presence, where we have staff or consultants representing us in different countries or different regions of the world. And I won't go through all of this, but as I talk a little bit of what the Grain Council has done during COVID-19, just to point out, back between March 15th and 18th that week, we pretty much shut down our operations globally, had all of our offices closed and everybody working from home. Since that, probably beginning in mid-May, we started to open up some of our offices, predominantly in parts of Asia, Taiwan, and Korea, a little bit into Japan since then. Now our Southeast Asia office is open, but the rest of our international office, I guess Tunis, Tunisia, our Middle East, Africa, Europe office is partially reopened. But we're still pretty much on a travel lockdown and are operating predominantly through virtual type of instances like this one here. Just a little bit about what's happened since COVID-19 in our programs worldwide. Very quickly, way back in March and into early April, we wanted to make sure to reassure customers around the world that the U.S. grain marketing system was operating and is open for business. We worked with a couple of our agribusiness members to put together some videos that showed operations on the river down in New Orleans and other export and grain transportation was open and working, including even loading of containers as we export quite a bit of DDGS, but even other products in containers out around the world. And then Ryan LeGrand, who was our CEO, wrote letters to almost all of the major corn importers and even government contacts in the major markets for us: Mexico, Japan, Korea, China, Taiwan, Egypt, I'm sure in Colombia, just to reassure them that the U.S. system is open and operating, and that the Department of Homeland Security saw U.S. grain export system as a important operation that would remain open, and we have remained open, and grain continues to flow into the export market. Have seen very little, if any, kind of slowdown to that due to COVID-19. Program-wise, so then our next step after reassuring our customers is, since we basically have a lockdown on travel and everybody was working from home, is to adjust our global programming and how we trade service or customer service outreach to the various contacts that we deal with globally. And so similar to this Zoom meeting, we've moved pretty much predominantly to virtual meetings, conferences, webinars, have just become the norm. Everything from very large conferences where we may have 700 or 800 customers on a conference that's being simultaneously translated into 3 or 4 different languages, even to smaller one-on-one meetings where we're trying to deal with a specific issue with a specific customer, and pretty much everywhere in between those two. We have had some limited face-to-face meetings in specific markets. The one picture kind of in the center there, the gentleman with the U.S. Grain Council blue hat and the mask, that's Hak-Soo Kim, our South Korea director. He actually, since things have opened up a little more in Korea, he's actually on top of a Panamax vessel of U.S. corn that's unloading at Incheon port, where the importer had some issues or questions, and so he actually went there in person and dealt with that. So we have had some limited face-to-face meetings, and those are usually on a much smaller scale, 10 people or less, in addition to the multitudes of different webinars and conferences that we've done in the virtual side of things. Switching next more to what's going on globally in the market. I'll start here. This is actually showing you where U.S. corn was going in the 2018-19 crop year. You may say, well, didn't we just end? You know, yesterday was the last day of the 2019-20 crop year officially, and so we're now officially today into the 2021 marketing year. But I put this up here, even though it's a little, over a year old data, just to show you the top markets for corn exports. Mexico being number 1, Japan number 2, Colombia 3, South Korea 4, and then Canada. As I go into what's going on the crop year we just finished and what's going on for new crop sales, you'll start to see some major changes. Predominantly Canada actually drops out of the top 5. It's still an important market for us, and even for you there in Michigan. I know a lot of corn even just goes by truck across the border up into parts of Canada there. And so not that Canada is not important, but we're seeing some major adjustments in other parts of the world that is bringing one big new customer into the discussion. So now if I look at the 2019-2020 crop year, like I said, we just finished. This data, it's still not completely, because it's the most up-to-date data I have, but it's not through the final crop year. So this is data through August 20th, but includes some of the, through August 20th. And so there's still going to be some additional exports will be added onto this, probably be later this week when we get the final numbers for the last crop year. But Mexico still is our number 1 corn market, but you can see China has moved into the top 5, and Canada has left it. If we look at overall corn exports in 2019-20, we're down about 11% versus 2018 and 2019 crop year. Many people may say, well, that must be because of COVID-19. It is to some degree, although a lot of our, we lost market share early in the crop year to Brazil. Brazil had a big crop, some decent prices, and a very weak Brazilian real, which really made Brazilian corn quite competitive into markets like Japan and South Korea. Even saw some Brazilian corn go into Mexico if we look back to October, November of last year. And so while total exports were down about 11%, they really picked up here the last tail end of the 2019-20 marketing year, and it's really taken off as we go. And we'll look at new crop corn exports here in a second. Shifting to some of the other products that we do cover, as mentioned, we do cover corn, barley, sorghum, and their co-products, which today predominantly include DDGS and ethanol. DDGS exports, this is comparing September through June sales this year versus the same period last year. For DDGS, the best data we can get is always a two-month lag. And so what we can see here that Mexico continues to be our largest market for DDGS exports. Sales to Mexico have been down a bit this year. Korea continues to be our second largest export market for DDGS. There we're actually up a little bit. Then you have the remaining top five are the dominating markets in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Thailand. Vietnam and Indonesia down a little bit, Thailand up quite a bit. I think actually all of those numbers for Southeast Asia will end in the positive by the time we finish we get all the data for the 2019-20 crop year on DDGS exports. We're really seeing some boom in DDGS exports. Things did slow down because of COVID on DDGS, just because the U.S. ethanol industry, as gasoline demand fell when everybody was staying home back in late March, April, and into May, which obviously affected how much people drive and how much gasoline and thus ethanol demand. And so DDGS production obviously falls when your ethanol production falls. And so as production fell and prices increased for the amount that was to be produced, we did see some exports slowing down. The ethanol industry is not completely back to normal, probably running about 90% of what it was pre-COVID, but we are almost back to normal, and we're seeing good production of DDGS and strong demand for it in the export market, predominantly into those Southeast Asia markets. Next, talk about ethanol and where those exports are going. Brazil continues to be our largest market, followed by Canada, India, the EU, and then South Korea. Much like the US, other markets are, especially for fuel ethanol demand, are seeing the same things, driving and gasoline demand slowing down, which then slows down the demand for imported ethanol in those markets. Brazil, we had been dealing with a tariff rate quota there that basically has expired as of August 30th, and still waiting to hear the final results on what Brazil is going to do with that. We thought we'd have that news over the weekend, and we still really don't. Canada, again, we're actually only down 3.9%, even with overall fuel demand being down a bit in Canada, so doing quite well there. India and South Korea. India does not allow imported ethanol to be blended for fuel, so they only allow domestic ethanol to be used. So the imported ethanol basically goes in for industrial use to replace, since all the domestic ethanol produced from sugarcane goes to the fuel blending. We're working quite hard to change that so that imported ethanol can be part of the fuel blend in India. And then South Korea, same thing. That's predominant, or almost all industrial ethanol. And places like South Korea, even some of that is getting redistributed to other parts of Asia. Some of the ethanol going to Korea is getting redistributed to the Philippines and Vietnam for fuel use. But where we've really seen that increase in South Korea, and even you see a large increase there in Mexico, up 80%, is for industrial or sanitizing uses of ethanol for hand sanitizers and other sanitizers use, is really driving some of the export demand for ethanol here lately. And I'll end on this. You've probably seen in the news, China has really dominated U.S. new crop purchases. So this is how much corn has been bought for the new crop, which we're now into that crop year here, the first day of September 1st for the 2020-21 crop year. And again, these are the latest data that we have, even including some of the spot sales. Even just yesterday, China announced another almost 600,000 tons of corn sales bought yesterday by China. So we're now at over 8.5 million tons of new crop corn sales to China. That's over 336 million bushels of corn. And so, we saw them import about 2.2 million tons, the crop year that just finished yesterday, and huge buying so far in the new crop year. With Mexico behind that at 2.9, and Japan, another big market for us. And Colombia and Honduras kind of finishing off the top 5 there. But quite excited. A lot of people are excited about the amount of corn that China is buying. And if we add that along with all the soybeans they've been buying, and how much of that is going to get shipped here yet this fall, we're seeing now where, elevation to elevate the grain off of barges into New Orleans, or even off of rail cars into to vessels out of the Pacific Northwest, is getting tighter and tighter because of all this big business that's happening with China and their big buys of corn and soybeans here. So I'll end it there. I know you're going to hear from Brian Lomar, our China director, and Stephen Wittig, our Mexico director. They'll get much more in depth in those 2 big important markets. Obviously, China is important because of all the new buying. Mexico is important because they're just have been our largest market for U.S. corn, U.S. DDGS, even U.S. barley is our largest market there in Mexico, and they're still the 2nd largest market for exports for sorghum. So you'll hear much more details on those 2 markets from them here. I think Brian is talking this evening, and Stefan is talking tomorrow. So I'll end it there and take any question anybody has.
So Carrie, one of the questions that I have is, especially with your slide you currently have up, there's always this question. We are always reminded of 2012, of when China had these purchases. They had them on ships, and then we had the issue with a trait and the price differential that changed from the time that they were those ships were loaded, loaded, and then got on their way. What is the confidence level that they'll actually take all of these purchases?
I'm fairly confident now. That issue back in 2011-12, that was, there was an unapproved event. They were accepting, and I basically think they pulled that out to try and stop the corn from coming in. Part of phase 1, and I didn't get into all the phase 1 details because I think Brian Lomar will cover a lot of that when he talks to you. But part of the phase 1 deal was to update how China does their GMO or biotech event approvals. And so right now, today, all of the corn events are approved that we produce in the U.S. are approved for importation into China. So, that shouldn't happen. I mean, if China wants, they'll find a way to stop things. But right now, corn prices inside of China are extremely high. They've come down a little bit, but they've been auctioning off, 4 million tons a week for 13 weeks now. They'll have another auction this Thursday. And then we're talking 2014 and 2015 crops, so 5-6-year-old corn. And it's, auctioning off at much higher prices than what you're getting in Michigan today. So there's about an $80 to $100 a ton spread between what I can import U.S. corn into China versus what domestic corn is. And so the prices are telling me they need and want this corn. Pig prices are extremely high. Even with the high prices, the average farmer is probably making $250, $300 a hog selling pigs because of the ASF situation as these pig farms rebuild back up. We're seeing that come on. And really seeing how they change feeding of hogs. There used to be a lot of restaurant and food waste that was made its way into the feeding of hogs. That's pretty much been outlawed. And even if you wanted to try and sneak it, it's the fastest way to reintroduce ASF into your herd. So these big, more sophisticated farming hog operations in China that are rebuilding are going to only corn or feed grain, soybean meal diets, no food waste at all. And so it's really driving what's going on in China. So I'm fairly confident that they will actually ship this product. If nothing else, there's $80 a ton margin to be made by it's basically the one state-run company in China that's doing all this buying. And so there's huge incentive just to pad your pocketbook into actually bringing this corn into China.
So as you look into your crystal ball, where do you see our growth potential in what corn product, and to what country do you think that will go?
And you're going to hear about Mexico later this week from Stefan. There's a lot of potential for ethanol into Mexico. There's some policy and even some legal issues we're dealing with, and Stefan will get into that when he talks to you. But as big as Mexico is, and it's a great market because it's easy for us to rail DDGS or corn right into. There is some corn and moves by vessel into Mexico from the U.S., but probably 80% of the corn actually goes by rail, and some even by truck. So there's some, as big as Mexico is, there's a lot of potential there still, and even on ethanol. Southeast Asia predominantly has been a DDGS market for us. Besides Vietnam, Indonesia, and Thailand, we're seeing DDGS now even going into New Zealand. That's really picked up the amount of DDGS they're buying there. And then on the corn side, we're really working hard to get our foot in the door. Vietnam has become they're basically the third largest importer of corn in the world today. And we're getting some of that market share, but it's predominantly the South American origin that they're buying, Brazilian and Argentine. And so really working there. So that's a big market that's there already. We just need to break in and get more market share along with the DDGS. We're already shipping there. And then even in Southeast Asia, looking at Indonesia, one of the world's fourth largest gasoline market today. We really, again, we're working on the policy side of things to get ethanol in there. Either and Indonesia imports about half of their gasoline, to even get pre-blended ethanol coming either from Singapore or from South Korea, where they're buying gasoline to be pre-blended into there, which we've now changed the policy that can happen, and working on direct blending of ethanol inside of Indonesia. So there's some big potential there. If you want to look more long-term, we're doing a lot of work in both East and West Africa. We see potential markets, everything from Kenya and Tanzania, even a little bit even into Ethiopia, and then the big market in West Africa and Nigeria. Those are probably more long-term, although we're starting to see little bits of sales going on there. But that's probably more 3-5 years down the road. I think some of the excitement that's going on in Southeast Asia and even into Mexico today is even more short-term that we can capture.
So when we look at the last question I've got, is there any trade agreements that we're close on, or that you believe is going to be important for us trading into the next 2 to 3 years?
That's a great question. I mean, they have started the discussions on the U.S.-Kenya free trade agreement. Those things never happen overnight, but that would be a big way of getting into the door into that East Africa market there of Kenya, and would be kind of a playbook to follow for other markets in Africa. So that long term, that's real key. The U.S.-UK trade agreement, people get excited about. Not that UK can't be a market, but I don't necessarily see it as going to be large or a growth market. What we would love to see, and is not being started at all, is is an FTA with one of those Southeast Asia markets, whether it's Vietnam would be ideal, but either, you know, even Indonesia or the Philippines to start there in one of those countries, I think would be very beneficial for U.S. ag, not just feed grains, but a lot of products. But right now, none of those Southeast Asia countries discussions are off the ground at all. So that's and it probably won't be until after the election when we see how that all plays out going forward.
Thank you, Carrie. I just wanted to mention that the corn marketing program does fund the Grains Council so they can continue their work and getting some trade and some new markets developed for us. We do have a couple of our Michigan growers who do serve on their action teams and are quite active with that. If anyone wants any more information, please feel free to contact us, and we're happy to get you in contact with the Grains Council as well. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Aaron Burns from MSU to give an update on some weed stuff.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm just trying to share my screen now. All right. I believe everybody should be able to be seeing that now. Thanks, Claire, for the introduction and also invitation to speak to this group today. So today I'm just gonna give a brief update on some of our 2020 corn weed observations and really how we're gonna set ourselves up to have a successful 2021 season. So you might be asking yourself why we're talking about weeds in the first day of September. You know, we normally think about weeds earlier on in the season, but how we finish 2020 is really gonna set us up for our weed control programs in 2021 and beyond. So we wanna make sure that we finish 2020 strong, and that would start with not spreading weed seeds amongst fields. So if you did have some weedy breaks in some of your fields, ensuring that you're not harvesting those fields and then going into a field right after that that's clean and you haven't done some extensive harvest clean out. So making sure that we're thinking about not spreading those amongst our fields as much as possible. Also, harvest gives you an awesome opportunity to scout weed breaks. So when you're out doing those observations, it'd be great if you can note to yourself where some of those weed breaks are, potentially what some of those weed species are, because then we can target 2021 management based off of what weeds you actually have in your field. So you can really tailor some of those programs. So ultimately, when we're making those observations, we can make our 2021 weed control program this winter based off of what we saw as breaks this past year. So this fall gives you just a great opportunity to really get that last snapshot of what's going on in your fields, what weeds might be problematic next year, and then what chemistries and herbicides am I going to use to try to address some of those in a much more tailored fashion. And then I'm just going to note one herbicide or one group of weeds that we have had in the state for a few years now, but are continuing to spread to some of our more northern counties, and those are Waterhemp and Amaran. We've had those in the southern tier of counties for quite a handful of years now, and we are seeing some spread of these populations. And the most alarming part is many of these populations are multiple resistant. And what I mean by that is that a specific plant is actually resistant to multiple different herbicide chemistries. So when we're thinking about Waterhemp, which is on the left of your screen, and Amaranth, which is on your right, most populations in the state are resistant to group 2, which are ALS inhibitors. We don't use them as much in corn, but are very vital in soybean and other crops. And then group 9, which is glyphosate. So most populations in the state are resistant to glyphosate, or the trade name is Roundup, or any kind of generic you use. So these two herbicide chemistries will not be effective at controlling these weed populations. Also, what slightly more alarming, specifically for corn growers, there are populations of Amaranth that are also resistant to atrazine, which is a fairly important chemical that we use in corn production. So these populations are actually 3-way resistant to ALS, glyphosate or Roundup, and then atrazine. So we'll go over in a bit where you want to look to start using resources to control some of these populations. And then more newer is the addition of PPO resistance, which is group 14. So we don't use these chemistries as much in corn, but you might use them in soybean or dry bean or other specialty crops. So just knowing that these weeds really do have the propensity to evolve resistance quite quickly, and we want to make sure that we preserve the chemistries that we use in corn for as long as possible to make them effective if you do happen to have these weeds start to infest your county and your fields. How you identify these is the first step is you want to understand, do you have Palmer amaranth and Waterhemp, or do you have some of our pigweeds that we've always had in the state, such as Powell amaranth and redroot pigweed. And Powell and redroot pigweed, which are not as aggressive as the two pigweeds that I'm showing on your screen, they have hairy stems. So if you actually go up to the plant, pull it out of the ground and feel the stem on those will feel pretty hairy. You can hold it up to the sunlight and you can see those light hairs. So if you see those hairs, you know those are redroot or Powell, and I know how to control those, and your programs will be quite effective. If the stems are shiny and do not have any hairs, that's when you have either Palmer amaranth or Waterhemp. So that's when you want to really start to think about maybe having some more aggressive herbicide programs that have some diversity in them. And then that would be the biggest decision. So it'd be great if you could understand the difference between Palmer amaranth and Waterhemp compared to our less aggressive pigweeds. And then if you're trying to understand, do you have Palmer in your field or Waterhemp in your field? Palmer amaranth has, on this picture on your left, very long petioles. So that's the part of the plant that connects the leaf to the actual stem. So if you go up to a plant, pull off a leaf, and you fold over this part onto the leaf, and that petiole, that stem portion, will be longer than the leaf itself. And that's only present in Palmer amaranth. Also, and that's a great way to understand early on in the season, when the plant's still fairly small, you can control that. Later on, if you do have some breaks that were not controlled by earlier herbicide applications, you can look at the stem, and Palmer amaranth on the females, so there's female and male plants, have these bracts, which are what I'm circling now. They're at the base of the petiole and the stem, and those are actually spiny. So if you went up and touched those, they'd actually pierce through your thumb. So they'd hurt. You'd know exactly what you were feeling right away. And Palmer amaranth is the only species that has that. And then the seed heads. So if you've seen a Palmer amaranth seed head, each individual branch of this seed head can be a couple feet long. So they're incredibly large plants, as opposed to Waterhemp, which still has pretty large seed heads, which is on your right, but they're much shorter. So overall, that's the main differences between these two. But the biggest goal would just to be to understand, do I have Palmer or Waterhemp in my field? And can I understand the identify characteristics early on, so when they're fairly small, under 3 inches, so we can still take some effective control measures. And then unfortunately, many times we see them co-occurring in the same field. So I just have a picture here of both Palmer amaranth and Waterhemp in the same field. This is in soybeans, so it's a bit easier to see these breaks in soybeans, but oftentimes we see the two populations within the same field. We're looking to control some of these species in corn. Total pre-program will not last all season long. Christy Sprague did some great Palmer amaranth and Waterhemp research a handful of years ago. And then those studies, pre-only programs, were highly dependent on weather. So did we get those timely rains after herbicide application to activate that herbicide and incorporate it into the soil layer so that we could control those germinating weed seeds? And often just you're asking a lot of a pre-program to pull all that heavyweight controlling these two species, which do have the ability to germinate later in the season, and even within that very dense, shady corn environment. So oftentimes we can walk through fields, and in late July we start to see some new seedlings, and these have an amazingly, they can grow inches a day and can still produce seed heads. So pre-only programs, if you do have these species, are not the optimal choice. And also post-only approaches can be variable. And when we're making post applications, we want to make sure these weeds are less than 3 inches tall, I know is a big ask. That can be pretty hard. You can scout one day and have 2-inch tall palmer, go out a few days later and now it's 7 inches. So when we're looking for some of these species, knowing their growth rate is quite quick and control goes down as the height increases. Early post programs can be an option, but timing is very critical. And then when we're making these early post applications, we want to make sure that we're putting in a residual component. So in addition to the foliar application you'd normally make, we want to put in a residual. So something like Zidua, Dual, Warrant, Harness. There's a number of residual products you can use in corn. And this will not control plants that are emerged, but will control those ones that are going to emerge later on. So this just gives you more of a security blanket and weeks of control than just our foliar application. But note that if you do go just the early post route, if you do have fails, so if the application fails, you have very limited options for rescue treatments because you're starting to get to the height cutoff of many herbicides that you can apply within corn. So overall, what we would recommend would be a 2-pronged approach, so a pre followed by post program for these 2 weed species, and this is the best option for consistent long-term control of both of these species. And we do have a fact sheet, so you don't have to scribble down all these herbicides right now. And I'll share our weeds website is msuweeds.com. I can put that in the chat box later too. That goes over all of your options for palmer and water hemp control in a number of field crops. So I just took a snapshot of the control programs for corn. And to note that corn does provide the best opportunity to control resistant palmer amaranth and water hemp compared to some of our other crops that are currently grown in their rotation, such as soybeans. So taking that corn phase as a really good opportunity to clean up any weedy breaks that you had in the previous phases of your rotation. So we have in this table listed some of the trade names, the active ingredients, those group numbers, which is how we categorize herbicides, so you can see, am I using a diversity in group numbers to delay resistance? And then also the application timing. So we're looking at combining some of these chemistries and group numbers together, and you can make a comprehensive pre followed by post program that's going to use the diversity of herbicide active ingredients. And that will give you the longest term control and also multi-year benefits in delaying resistance in some of those populations. And then also on a note to highlight another program that we have going on within the MSU Weed Science team is our commercial comparisons. These have been done since the 90s. They've been going on for quite some time, and we do them in corn. And then Christy Sprague does hers in soybeans. And we just ask each one of our industry partners each year to provide up to 4 different herbicide programs that they would recommend for our region in Michigan, so mid-Michigan, southern Michigan, the thumb area. And we then do weed control ratings throughout the year, and also corn injury, which is important for early season control. And then we do the cost of each program, and then we take these to yield. So what do they yield? And then the biggest thing to look at is the economic returns. So what's the end output of these treatments, which take into consideration both the cost, the yield, and then ultimately what yield loss you're getting from unsuccessful weed control. So we have a large number of these programs that we put out every year, and then we post these fact sheets. So I'll give you our website where you can get these, so you can see where your current program stacks up, or if you're looking to maybe change things up, where those fall out. So that's just a good way to look at some of these programs overall. And then this is just a snapshot of our website, which is msuweeds.com. We have all of our research extension fact sheets, videos. We put on a large number of videos this past year because we couldn't have Weeds Day, unfortunately. So we did take some videos of some of our treatments in those fields that you can see. And I share this with the weed science team. So there's a large number of great information across a variety of field crops. And then also my email and my phone number. So if you do have any weedy questions, feel free to call or email at any time. And that's it for my little short wrap up.
Thanks, Aaron. We do have a couple questions. So as we were scouting some fields, we saw some velvet leaf, probably more of an abundance of velvet leaf than we have in the past. Was this an issue throughout the state? And also, what have you seen maybe on the programs has been the biggest escape this year?
That's a great observation, Jim. And that is something that I got calls from in corn early on. I know soybeans, potato growers I've talked to had velvet leaf breaks. And then I was recently on a call with a weed scientist from Illinois, and they had tons of velvet leaf breaks. So this was just a velvet leaf year for the Midwest. And it's just interesting, each one of these talks I do, that's a weed that keeps coming up. And it's not a new weed, but it's definitely a new break that we've had. So I think some of our weather early on with different, various extremes in precipitation. So we had a lot followed by not very much. That can play a very large role in herbicide efficacy. So I think next year we definitely want to be scouting specifically after our pre-emergence herbicides. So going out 2 to 3 weeks after those herbicide applications and looking for some of those breaks, because there's going to be a lot of new weed seeds that go into the soil seed bank from this past year from some of those breaks. But we do have, effective chemistry. So it's an interesting thing to note, but not something that I would be, super alarmed about. But it is a weed that can get pretty tall and get pretty big.
So what about mare's tail? Were you seeing an issue with that this year as well?
So mare's tail, that's a great question. So, last year, especially with all the prevent plant acres, we had a lot of mare's tail out there. And it's pretty noticeable if you have some breaks in soybeans, because those plants will go right above the soybean crop canopy, and then they have weed seeds that can float for miles. So you can be pretty good at controlling mare's tail, but if your neighbor even 10, 15 miles away doesn't control mare's tail, those weed seeds can float around. So in corn, you're making sure the only times I've really heard about problematic mare's tail populations is in no-till situations that didn't have effective burn downs. So if you are a no-till corn grower, ensuring that you're planting clean. So that's just a good recommendation across the board, but you don't want to plant into any standing mare's tail vegetation. So making sure that you have those burn down herbicide applications that are controlling those weeds. And then on the soybean side, it's choosing a trait technology package that works for you and gives you effective post-emergence options. So I would say 99.9% of the populations in Michigan are resistant to Roundup. So just ensuring whatever you're choosing in soybeans gives you a different chemistry option to apply over the top later in the season to control some of those populations.
So I'd like to remind everybody, if you do have some questions, please at the very bottom on your toolbar, it'll be under the Q&A. Please type in your question there. With that burn down issue then, Aaron, too, is do you have any recommendations, or would you recommend some application of herbicides yet this fall for next year for some of those fields that may be going into corn?
So yes, the answer would be yes to that. So if you do have mare's tail issues in soybeans this fall, so you've harvested, go out a week or two after harvest, and horseweed can emerge in the fall or the spring. So in the fall, we'll see small rosettes, which are just little circular plants. They're only a few inches in diameter, but those are the ones you'll want to control, because in the spring, the second it gets, even just a little bit warm, they'll grow quite quickly. So I'll put the fact sheet in for horseweed control into the chat, and we've outlined a number of good fall burn down programs and then spring burn down programs that you can couple with those to making sure that you're planting into the cleanest field you can as possible.
So I think that would also hold true for perennials and biennials as well, that it is a practice that is acceptable to apply in the fall to help get rid of those.
Correct. Yep. You're just trying to plant clean, and then that gives you it lessens the weight of your spring burn down, because now your spring burn down, you're only going to have smaller weeds to control. So you're not asking as much from some of your herbicides to control some of those larger weeds that did either survive throughout the fall or germinated in the fall and overwintered. So that's a good practice.
One last question. predictions for 21?
That's a good question. I mean, I was amazed at how well 2020 went, given our 2019 season and all the prevent plant and weed seeds that we had going into those. So I think, you know, from the fields I've seen this year, that weed control has looked a lot better than 2019. So that's good when you can control those weedy breaks. But keep in mind, yeah, the velvet leaf issue, and ensuring that when you're looking at weed control programs and herbicides, that might be a newer one on your list, just given the uniqueness of just that general observation across multiple grower groups, that was one of those breaks.
Thank you, Erin, for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Marty for an update on corn diseases.
Apologies, just unmuting myself, finding controls here. Okay, good morning, everybody. So my name is Martin Chilvis. I'm a field crops pathologist here at Michigan State. And we'll have a bit of a chat this morning about some of the diseases that we've seen, I guess, and things to consider. So just in general, it's been very quiet on the disease front. And that's, you know, primarily due to those very dry conditions that we had. You know, diseases really need moisture for infection of plants, and we just haven't had a great deal of moisture this season. It's been dry for the most part, so that's really kept things suppressed for the bulk of things. I do want to talk a little bit about tar spot, just given how new this is, and you know, still an emerging issue, particularly in Michigan. Here are a couple of photos. I'm sure most people are aware of what tar spot is now. You know, it looks like tar has been flecked onto the leaves. Unfortunately, you know, tar spot's got that real potential to explode pretty quickly. And part of the reason is that each one of those little black spots you're seeing is one of these structures. So this underneath the microscope, I've got 4/1000th of an inch scale down at the bottom there. And you can see that these things are packed with spores. Excuse me. So there's a lot of little spores in here, and they are exuded up through the through those little black tar spot structures onto the leaf surface, where they then get rain splash dispersed or wind dispersed onto other corn plants, and can then go on to infect again. So looking at that in terms of disease cycle, this is what we're looking at then. So tar spot is coming from infected corn residue from previous years. It can potentially blow in from other fields as well. So even if you've never had corn in that particular field, you can have tar spot spores blow in from outside. And so we tend to see that in terms of pattern of disease on the plants too. If you're caught on corn, we may very well see some tar spot down low on that plant, maybe in July. If you're not caught on corn, you've never had corn in that field, for example, we might see tar spots starting to develop on the tops of the plants, and that would sort of indicate spores, you know, potentially blowing in from outside and settling in on the tops of those plants and starting the disease that way. But yeah, unfortunately, it's one of those diseases. It's a new disease again for us here in the US. And it's here to stay because it can survive on that residue and can move, you know, from field to field pretty easily. So again, it takes probably about 2 to 3 weeks from when a spore lands on the plant until when we see some of those black tar spot structures forming on the leaf. So it can happen pretty quickly. Those cycles, you know, every 2 to 3 weeks can really blow things up quite quickly. One important thing just to sort of be aware of is how to differentiate tar spot from other diseases or other things that are out there on the plant. On the left-hand side there, you can see insect frass or bug poop, right? And you can see that with a little bit of moisture, I'm able to rub those spots off the plant. So insect frass will either scrape off, or with a little bit of water, it will dissolve off the leaf itself. The other thing at this time of year as well is rust. So, you know, rusts generally have like an orangish type appearance, but later in the season, they'll start to form a second spore stage, such as teleospores, that have a dark appearance. And you can see those on that leaf there on the right-hand side. So there are a couple of things that might be confused with tar spot. Generally, tar spot's really easy to identify. It's got sort of that raised appearance to it. Another really good trick if you're trying to identify tar spot is that the tar spot lesion will be both on the top side of the plant, but it'll also be on the bottom side of the leaf. So that one tar spot lesion will be, on the top, turn it over, you should be able to see that starting to protrude through the bottom side of the leaf. So one way to differentiate those. And so the other thing I wanted to sort of mention too is that this is a pretty new disease, right? So in this graphic here, what I'm showing is the initial sort of introductions, or where it was found in Indiana and Illinois in 2015 and 2016, sort of shown in those lighter yellows. And it was fairly quiet for a couple of years. 2017, we had it again in Allegan County, but really nowhere else. Pretty sort of, well, it was starting to pick up in Allegan, but really that was the only county in Michigan that it was present in. And then it wasn't until 2018 where we had a lot of moisture during the season, cloudy days, that the disease really blew up, and we suffered some pretty significant losses, up to maybe 50 bushels, perhaps a little bit more in some fields here in Michigan. And really the disease has sort of been centered around Lake Michigan there in terms of the severity. But in 2019, we saw it spread up into the thumb of Michigan and out into Iowa as well. So, I mean, coming into 2020, we were pretty concerned. As I said at the start, it's been pretty dry, so that sort of kept things overall, other diseases like grey leaf spot, northern leaf blight, pretty suppressed. But I would say compared to last year, we're probably behind in terms of the amount of tar spot that's developed, even though, 2019, we also had, fairly dry July and August. So I'd say we're just a little bit behind that. I would caution everyone, though, that this disease can move quickly. And the thing I'd be really concerned about now is the potential for lodging as well. And so this map here, you can see that the grey colouring is showing where tar spot has been found in previous years. And the yellow is just where we've had positive confirmations this particular year. And you can look for that online if you want to just Google corn IPM pipe, and you'll be able to find those maps that are freely available. In terms of management then, thinking about next year, again, this disease is not going away, and hybrid resistance or susceptibility is really important. So we really want to think about selecting hybrids with good resistance, and companies are doing a good job at screening. We're helping out with screening of varieties too at a location. I'll show you a picture of that in a second as well. And the other thing I'll mention as well, so foliar fungicides for management of tar spot. We've got this website up, Google Crop Protection Network, and we've got a lot of information there about fungicide efficacy. We've got PDFs that you can download, just listing all the different fungicides and their efficacy. Based on last year's data, we only had one season of data, so we weren't really able to differentiate a lot of products. I think coming out of the end of this season, we'll be able to have a much better separation of products, ranking them from fair through to excellent, just depending on how they sort of performed. And I think one of the more important things for us really is the timing of fungicides. And so, we've thought a lot about spraying at about R1, silking and tassel appearance rate. But now we're sort of trying to refine that a little bit, trying to figure out if we should be going a little bit later than that too, especially for tar spot. And this particular figure here is just showing dry matter accumulation. If you look at that yellow line there, you can see grain accumulation or dry matter accumulation in the grain rate. And so you can see that continues even into R5. So even once we're at dent, we're still continuing to set dry matter in those kernels. So we're sort of wondering, should we be potentially making fungicide applications a little bit later than what we traditionally think of? And that sort of played out last year where we had somebody make an application at R4 and we saw about a 20 bushel protection because of that. And that was under irrigation. So it's pretty specific sort of conditions under irrigation, and disease is really starting to take off. So last year what we had out was really asking a question probably prior to that, like what is the value of a V6 or V8 fungicide application, potentially mixed in with a herbicide application, what value is there to task spot management. And unfortunately, those really early applications, I don't think we're really getting much value from. I mean, it'd be great if we could, because potentially include that with, you know, that other pass through the field for weed control. But we've got such a, you know, a long season that applications at V6 or V8 don't give you the protection we really need later in the season, right? So this particular graph here, what we're showing is the amount of disease on different treatments, right? So we've got a non-treated check to the far left-hand side here. And so you can see there's a lot of disease in that particular plot over the whole season. A V6 treatment there, really no different. A V8 along here, a little bit less disease than that V6 on non-treated. But really where we were seeing the better protection was, you know, VT R1 through to R2. And so again, what we're really doing now is we're pretty aware that, you know, those R1 timings, maybe R1 through to R3, maybe R4 is probably where we're better at trying to finesse the timing for task spot management. So that's what we're really focused on this particular season. So this year I set up some trials as well, just to try and get see if we could set up a disease threshold to spray at. And so this is really just a hypothesis, just something we're just testing at this point in time. So I wouldn't necessarily use it as a complete rule, but this is what we're thinking. So if we've got less than 1 in 100 plants infected, or 1% of plants infected in the field, I think we should probably wait and watch in terms of fungicide applications for task spot. It's going to be too early for the most part. We've got to also think about, you know, the time of the season we're at and all those sorts of components, and other diseases. Of course, we don't want to lose sight of managing northern leaf blight and grey leaf spot. So what we implemented this season in a few trials around the state here was, once we got to about 50% of plants infected or more at the ear leaf or above with any level of task spot, be it single spots on the ear leaf or above, on 50% or more of plants, that's when we were thinking we should potentially spray. And so we've got some trials out this season, and I just sprayed some corn in Allegan yesterday. It wasn't planted until June 6th, I believe. So it's pretty late planted corn. It's still in the R4 growth stage. So still, you know, plenty of grain fill to protect. And so we'll see how that pans out by the end of the season. Of course, the other big factor here is how much this disease is going to develop, you know, in late August or September, and how's that going to impact grain fill. So there's some things we're working on this season. Here's a shot of our Decatur location that we're doing a lot of screening. So in here, we've got hundreds of plots. So these are about 20-foot long plots that we have. They're 4 rows wide, so we've got a lot of material packed in here. So we've got a lot of fungicide efficacy work, so comparing different fungicides to see how they perform for task spot management, fungicide timing as well, a lot of those trials. We're screening hybrids for companies too, to see how they perform, because again, that's going to be, you know, one of our #1 go-to things, like figuring out which hybrids that we should avoid or those that we should lean towards, I guess. And then we're also working with other people like Addie Thompson here. And so she's got a corn diversity panel. So some of this material might have genes that you know, might not be showing in some of the other core material that's out there that we might be able to potentially move through and work with companies to get into newer varieties that will come out for better management of task spot. Of course, we don't want to forget about other corn diseases. We've got some northern leaf blight here, you know, susceptible variety on the left compared to a resistant variety. So don't forget about those things. And just going over task spot management, you know, in really all diseases, you know, the weather is a huge driver. Obviously for under irrigation, you're going to have more leaf wetness too, and that's going to help drive disease. Hybrid resistance, very, very important, and something to think about as we start to make seed selection for next year. And I should just note too, just because we didn't have a bad outbreak of task spot this year, doesn't mean we won't have a bad outbreak next year. There's plenty of inoculum now in the state to set up disease and for that to potentially explode, right, if we get a lot of moisture during the season. So it certainly hasn't gone away. And we're going to want to scout for well-timed fungicide applications. You know, typically we think R1, but we might have to think about that, you know, through to potentially R4 growth stage. Crop rotation will help a little bit, but again, spores can move in from outside. same with residue management. It's really not the primary key. And just for the end of this growing season, still scout for lodging potential. So tar spot can develop pretty quickly. So just keep an eye on those fields and check for lodging potential, do the push test, make sure you've still got stalk integrity. And if you are recognizing, fields at risk, potentially try and harvest those first, so you're not picking them up off the ground. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions that people have.
So Marty, we're probably just going to have two questions. One I've got, and then question is around the fact that we didn't see much disease in the wheat. Is there and will there be a correlation that we may not see a significant impact of tar spot next year? That's question number one.
Okay.
Second question will be around anthracnose. Are you noticing more anthracnose over the past few years?
Okay. I guess I'll deal with the anthracnose one first. So I haven't personally noticed an uptick in anthracnose. If particular folks are struggling out there, I'd certainly like to hear about that, see what you're seeing. Anthracnose is a bit of a tricky one because the stalk rot component that we have is not necessarily tied to the foliar symptoms of anthracnose that we see. So anthracnose is perhaps the earliest disease that we typically see in a cornfield, right? So it'll show us, those lesions in very small corn, but that doesn't translate. There's been research done to show that early infection doesn't necessarily translate to stalk rots. So it's kind of difficult to deal with in that sense. So I personally haven't noticed an increase in that. I'd be very interested to work with folk on that. What can happen sometimes is in the breeding pipelines, yield is king, right? And we may be potentially missing some of the other disease resistance components as we bring new hybrids through the pipeline. So that could be a factor, or there could be some change in the actual organism that causes the anthracnose too, or potentially changing environmental conditions. With respect to the disease that we saw in the wheat, head scab was pretty minimal this season. I think our ear molds will tend to be pretty minimal too. It was fairly dry again, while we were stilking, so we shouldn't see a whole lot of ear molds. Certainly there's going to be pockets of the state, that had those unfortunately timed rains and moisture events perhaps to promote ear molds. And then Western mint cutworm, I think the overall pressure was fairly low this season, but again, if you were in a field that had a lot of Western mint cutworm pressure, I'd be concerned about that, potentially driving up the mycotoxin or DON levels. Tar spot next year, it all depends on the moisture we get in 2021. If we get a lot of rainfall events like we did in 2018, we're going to be in for some pretty severe outbreaks of tar spot. It's not going away. It's in the fields already. It doesn't migrate up from down south or anything like that. It's here, it's in the fields. So that's the concern. Especially, up in the thumb region, I would say this year we would have been at pretty low risk to tar spot just because it was sort of moving in that direction, right? But now we've got inoculum there and it's had another year to sort of incubate it. We've got more of that potential for next season. So I'd be certainly not taking your eye off the ball with respect to tar spot.
So one last on the tar spot. Have you seen or is if it has tar spot, are the plants more susceptible to green snap?
Oh, that's a good question. And what do people mean by green stem exactly? Like issues with dry down or?
No, green snap.
Green snap, sorry.
Yeah, my personal is no, green snap typically happens early on, and it usually happens because there's just dramatic growth that occurs and a fast growth, and the plant, the stalk is weakened because it's growing so fast, and it takes a while for those cell walls to actually thicken in order to hold the plant. So typically green snap happens early in the season where the tar spot is later on. So
Yeah, that's right. Sorry, I misheard you, Jim. Yeah, exactly. There wouldn't be any real correlation between the two. You know, what we're concerned about with tar spot is it prematurely shutting the plants down, right? And as it does that, it's going to take resources out of the corn stalk and weaken that corn stalk. And so that's the concern that we'll have lodging. And I know last year in Southwest Michigan, you know, we had some good yielding corn, but some of it was flat on the ground because of tar spot, you know, moving in late. So.
Thank you, Marty. And thank you again to Aaron and Carrie for your time this morning. I'm going to go ahead and give you guys a short presentation on what we've been seeing out in the fields. So as far as our Between the Rows tour goes, we started doing yield checks out starting in August. And so these are the checks that we completed throughout the state. We had over 330 checks, and then the little orange markers are also the 3 FFA chapters that were able to join us this year and we did some training with them, and they also completed some checks for us. This is what we got for our yield checks this year. So we're looking at 180. We're looking at that a little high, but the quality of what we saw in the field this year was pretty good. The one thing we did notice was the variability in the fields. It's just something that we haven't really seen that much before, but as far as disease, insects, weeds, it was pretty minimal compared to other years. So things were looking pretty good. We know that the heat this past week probably did some damage to some of that yield potential, but this is where we're at as far as our yield checks that we completed on Friday. And then here are the county averages that we did calculate from all of our yield checks. Again, we did have over 330 checks across the state. So each of those counties has quite a good representation of what is going on in the state. If you need any additional information on this or any more or specific stuff, go ahead and put that in the chat or the Q&A. I'm happy to answer those questions for you.